Joining us now is New Jersey Senator Cory Booker, who you just saw speaking there today in the Senate chamber. Senator Booker, thank you so much for your time tonight.
Thank you, Rachel. It's good to be on with you.
Let me ask you, I feel like I've turned to you often, Senator, sort of at moments of sort of where we need moral focus. What conversation do you hope we will be able to have a year from now, on the second anniversary of the January 6th attack, that we cannot have now? What sort of progress do you think we can make as a country in the year ahead, given what has happened to us in the year behind?
Well, let me first just really push the point that if we just see this as an isolated incident, as one day that we mark every year, and forget that this is a stream of our nation's history where violent forces seeking to stop democracy with authoritarian bents have been a long part of our country's history. In fact, every step we've tried to take forward has been met with violence. Remember, we talk about the suffragettes and their marches, but they were beaten, they were tortured. We talk about the efforts for voting rights. John Lewis, you can go through the number of people that were beaten. And those early elected officials, and they're the first senator in the United States Senate that was black. It was during Reconstruction when blacks had unfettered access to voting. Well, that was met with violence. Even now, since January 6th, the violent threats on officials in our country, for federal judges, it's gone up threefold. For members of Congress, the threats have gone up twofold. For election officials, independent election officials, Reuters has documented hundreds and hundreds of violent threats. You take a guy like Al Schmidt, Republican from Pennsylvania, who dared to say that the election was just and fair, threatened. They singled out his children to threaten to murder them. So we have to understand that we're actually a unique, amazing country, but we see across the planet, from Europe to South America, authoritarian forces pushing back on democracy, undermining democracy, and democracy is on its retreat from Hungary to Turkey. You see the forces, the demagogic forces we saw pushing back on democracy. So the positive, Rachel, is clear. Every dark chapter of our history was, as the great historian you had on, an ignition point. King called the violence. He goes, what I'm worried about today, we have to repent for, is not the vitriolic words and violent actions of the bad people, but the appalling silence and inaction of the good people. The hope I have, the story that I have, as this thread continues, and you see it in voter suppression, people trying to gerrymandering, trying to undermine fair and free democracy. What I hope now is that this is an ignition point, that more people understand that this is not just about pointing fingers of contempt at otherizing people, that this is them. No, this is not about finding blame. It's about us as Americans taking this moment, taking this day, and not just commemorating it, but recognizing it and accepting responsibility that we have to make the change.
In terms of the political nature of the violence that the country faced a year ago, I have found myself sort of struggling today with whether or not that violence is political or whether it is the end of politics. Right? You've talked about authoritarian movements. I see the portrait of Gandhi behind you, Senator, and I know about your commitment, your spiritual commitment to nonviolence, as well as your strategic commitment to nonviolence. When President Biden today talked about a dagger being held to the throat of America, he was talking about people trying to achieve power through force rather than through politics. And I find myself struggling today with the kind of history that you've talked about, where our politics has often bled into violence and where commitments to nonviolence have often just been met with more violence. I mean, finding a way out of this does mean learning from history, but I also think it means being able to name the moment that we are in. And whether this is not just about changing our form of government, but whether this is about abandoning politics for something that is non-political and that is just about force.
Yeah, and I think you're right. We need to name what's going on right now. It's not over. Last year, an event when they left the Capitol, it wasn't the end. There is a strong movement in this country to undermine our democracy, and it is perilous. Whether it is taking away independent election officials and trying to shift decisions on which electors you send to the state away from nonpartisan individuals like we're seeing in places like Georgia and put it back in a partisan legislature. So that when the president calls this time, as he did to an independent election official, and tries to pressure them, well, we see how many of my colleagues and others have been folding to that pressure. That's about undermining our democracy. The racial elements of this are clear. How can we have a nation? I really had the naivete as a child listening to the stories of my parents and grandparents about the fear and the violence around trying to vote, about the two different voting systems. But now we live in a country where predominantly black counties, areas in Georgia, the wait to vote, the average wait to vote in predominantly black communities, as documented by Reuters and Brennan, is about almost an hour, about 51 minutes. For a white voter, it's 6 minutes. Think about that for a second. You have places, do we want to live in a country where a black person has to wait 7, 8 times longer to vote? And there's some areas in America like Texas where in minority communities, the wait to vote is 7, 8 hours. That's a day's work. Are we really saying that we're going to tolerate a country where people have to be able to afford to give up hours of work or taking care of their children? That's America today. If you don't think our democracy is in peril by all these threats on voting officials, all of these voter suppression laws that are creating such distinctly different experiences in voting in America, then if you are passive and sitting on the sideline at this moment and not taking some responsibility to say, I got to do something different, like generations before who faced dark moments, then you are part of the problem. And so this is why one of the best things about the day, that dark day for me, was seeing how many ordinary people rose to the occasion, whether it was staffers making sure we protected those boxes that were sitting in the wells of the Senate, whether it's people like Eugene Goodman, who, I'm telling you, if he did not lead the mob away from the Senate chamber, someone would have got killed. Most likely it would have been the people in the mob that would have gotten killed, because there were people with guns around us. As one of my favorite people, Mr. Rogers, says, when moments like that, look for the helpers. Well, I'm hoping that people look to themselves and say that I need to be a helper, because January 6th may have ended last year, but the crisis of violence and the threats to our democracy are persisting, and we are not immune to what is happening around this planet in other areas where democracies are being worn down or eroding, and democratic principles and democratic ideals are falling to demagoguery and leaders who have authoritarian aims.
Senator Cory Booker from the great state of New Jersey. Senator, thanks for being with us tonight. I know it's been an intense day and an emotional day today. It means a lot to me that you were here tonight. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Rachel.
All right, we'll be right back. Stay with us.